Enlightenment, often described as a state of spiritual awakening or liberation, is a profound transformation of consciousness. It's a state where individuals experience a deep sense of interconnectedness with everything and a profound understanding of the nature of reality. One intriguing aspect of this state is that the physical body is not needed after enlightenment. Here's why. The concept of enlightenment, in many ways, is that our bodies are like an oasis. They seem real and substantial, the center of our existence. We take care of them, feed them, dress them, and exercise with them. They are our vehicles, carrying us through this physical world, just as the oasis carried us through the desert. But what happens when you reach the point of enlightenment? When you drink from the spiritual oasis, suddenly the importance of the body vanishes because it was never the destination. It was only a tool, a temporary guide for something much larger. In ancient philosophies, the body was often seen as a vessel, a house for the soul. Take the teachings of the Buddha, for example. He referred to the body as a raft. Imagine yourself needing to cross a river. You build a raft and use it to float to the other side. But when you reach the shore, you don't carry the raft with you. You leave it behind. Just like the raft, the body is necessary for a time, but once you've crossed into enlightenment, it's no longer needed. At this point, you might wonder, how can something that feels so real, so central to our daily lives, be unnecessary? To understand that, we need to dig deeper into what the body truly represents. Many belief systems, from Hinduism to early Christian mysticism, describe the body as a shell. It houses our consciousness while we exist in the physical world. But it's not who we are. It's like the clothes we wear. When you take off your jacket, you're still you, right? The jacket doesn't define your essence. The same is true of the body. Let's take the parable of the blind men and the elephant, which is found in both Jain and Buddhist traditions. Each blind man touches a different part of the elephant and describes what he feels. One touches the trunk and says the elephant is like a snake. Another touches the leg and says it's like a tree. They argue, each convinced they've grasped the whole truth. But the reality is much larger than their limited perceptions. The body is like the part of the elephant we've been conditioned to touch, but it's not the whole story. Enlightenment allows us to step back and see the entire elephant, the full, boundless nature of our true self. Enlightenment, in its purest form, is the realization that you are not your body. You are the awareness behind it. You are the observer, the eternal consciousness. Many spiritual traditions, especially those rooted in Eastern philosophy, teach that once this realization is deeply understood, the body becomes almost irrelevant. The enlightened being no longer identifies with it. You might still carry it around for a while, just like you wear shoes to walk on a rocky path, but it's not who you are anymore. Eventually, like the raft, the body will be left behind entirely. This detachment from the body can be a difficult concept to grasp, especially in a world that places so much emphasis on physical appearance and health. Our culture glorifies youth, beauty, and fitness. But what if we told you that none of these things actually matter in the long run? Think about the wisdom of the ancient yogis who spent years meditating in caves, completely detached from their physical needs. They didn't care about how their bodies looked or felt because they understood something profound. The body is temporary, a passing phenomenon. It grows old, weakens, and eventually dies. But the soul, the true self, is eternal. One of the most famous stories that illustrate this comes from the Hindu tradition, where the great sage Ramana Maharshi was asked about the body's role after enlightenment. He responded with a simple analogy. He said, "The body is like a fan that continues to spin even after the electricity is turned off. Once you achieve enlightenment, the life force that keeps the body going is no longer necessary. But the body might continue to function for a time, like a fan slowly coming to a stop. The enlightened individual remains detached from it, aware that it's just a temporary vehicle." This idea is not limited to Eastern thought. Even early Christian mystics like Saint Teresa of Avila spoke about the soul's journey toward union with the divine. She described how, as one grows closer to God, the concerns of the body fall away. The mystic no longer desires material comforts or physical pleasures. Instead, they become consumed by a spiritual fire, a burning passion for the divine that renders the body almost invisible. So what does this mean for you right here, right now? It means that everything you've been taught about your body being essential to your identity is only a fraction of the truth. Yes, it's important in this moment, in this physical world, but once you reach the point of spiritual awakening, its relevance fades. You realize that your body was only ever a tool, a way for your soul to navigate the physical realm. And once you've navigated it, once you've crossed the river, you don't need the raft anymore. It's a liberating thought, isn't it? To know that you are so much more than your physical form, to understand that your body, with all its aches and pains, desires and fears, is not the real you. You are the consciousness that exists beyond it, the eternal awareness that doesn't age, doesn't die, and isn't confined by physical limitations. But the journey to this realization isn't easy. It requires a deep shift in perspective and a willingness to look beyond the material world and see the spiritual truth that lies beneath it. It's a process of unlearning everything you thought you knew about yourself. Yet once you begin to grasp this truth, the world looks different. The body feels lighter and less significant. You start to see it for what it is: a temporary tool, a guide through the desert of life, leading you to the oasis of enlightenment. And once you reach that oasis, you won't need the body anymore. It served its purpose, and now, like the raft, it's time to let it go. As the illusion of the body begins to unravel, so does the way we see the world. If you've ever had a moment of deep clarity, perhaps while meditating or simply in the quiet of nature, you may have felt a separation between your body and your mind. That stillness, that moment of peace, is a glimpse of what lies beyond the physical. It's the beginning of realizing that the body, with all its weight and limitations, is not the final destination. But why is this so difficult to fully understand? The answer lies in how deeply we've been conditioned to equate our identity with our physical form. From the moment we are born, we are taught to see the world through the lens of the body. Our entire experience of life, our senses, our emotions, even our sense of self, is filtered through this physical shell. We see ourselves as separate beings, confined by skin and divided from everything else around us. This separation feels real, but in the state of enlightenment, it becomes clear that it's all an illusion. The famous metaphor of Plato's cave comes to mind here. In his parable, prisoners are chained inside a dark cave, facing a wall. All they know of the world comes from shadows cast by objects behind them, lit by a fire. These shadows are their reality. They believe they are seeing the truth, but it's only a distorted reflection. When one prisoner escapes and steps outside into the light, he is blinded at first, but eventually realizes the truth. The shadows were never real. Similarly, our physical body and the world we perceive through it are like shadows on the wall. They seem solid and substantial, but they're merely projections of a deeper truth. When we talk about the body not being needed after enlightenment, it's because enlightenment is that moment when you step out of the cave and see the light for what it is. The body and all that comes with it, our pain, desires, pleasures, and even our suffering, are part of the shadow world. They serve a purpose in helping us learn and grow, but once we awaken to the light, we no longer need to hold on to them. Take, for example, the concept of moksha in Hinduism. Moksha is the ultimate liberation from the cycle of birth and death known as samsara. The body is born, ages, and dies, and this cycle repeats lifetime after lifetime. But the soul, the true self, is eternal. It's only when we achieve moksha, this spiritual liberation, that we transcend the need for a body altogether. The enlightened soul no longer returns to the physical world because it has no more lessons to learn and no more karma to resolve. The body, in this sense, is only needed for as long as we are entangled in the material world. You might wonder, but if the body is just an illusion, why does it feel so real? Why do we suffer physical pain and emotional turmoil if it's all just a projection? This is a question that many spiritual seekers grapple with. In Buddhism, there's a concept called dukkha, often translated as suffering or dissatisfaction. The Buddha taught that life in the material world is inherently marked by dukkha because we are attached to things that are impermanent, including our bodies. We cling to health, to youth, to physical pleasure, and when these things inevitably fade, we suffer. But once we realize the impermanence of the body, once we stop identifying with it, the suffering begins to dissolve. The Zen master Shunryu Suzuki once said, "You are perfect just as you are, and you could use a little improvement." It's a paradox, but one that speaks to the heart of the human experience. The body, in its imperfection, serves as the ground for our spiritual growth. It gives us the opportunity to experience duality, pleasure and pain, joy and sorrow, so that we can ultimately transcend it. But in the state of enlightenment, the need for duality disappears. The body, once a necessary teacher, becomes obsolete. The philosopher Alan Watts often spoke of the body as something we temporarily inhabit, like putting on a mask for a play. We act out our part in the physical world, with all its drama and emotion. But when the play is over, we take off the mask and return to our true nature. Enlightenment, in this sense, is the realization that the play is just that, a play. The body is part of the costume, nothing more. Once the performance is over, the costume is no longer needed. This brings us to a critical point. The body isn't the problem. It's our attachment to it that binds us. The body, like everything in the material world, is transient. It's here for a time and then it's gone. When we cling to it, when we believe it's who we are, we suffer. But when we see it for what it is, a temporary vessel, we can begin to let go. In Taoism, there's a beautiful concept of Wu Wei, often translated as effortless action or non-action. It's the idea that the most profound moments in life happen when we stop forcing things and simply allow them to unfold. The body, in many ways, is part of this flow. We don't need to fight against it, nor do we need to overly identify with it. It's part of the river of life, carrying us along. But when the time comes, we can release it and continue on without it. One of the most striking teachings on this subject comes from the Bhagavad Gita, where Lord Krishna tells the warrior Arjuna that the soul is eternal, unaffected by birth or death. Weapons cannot cut it, fire cannot burn it, water cannot wet it, and the wind cannot dry it. This soul is ancient, immutable, and beyond the physical. The body may be subject to harm, aging, or illness, but the soul remains untouched. Enlightenment is the moment when this truth becomes not just something you believe, but something you know. And in that knowing, the body's significance fades. As we walk this path toward enlightenment, it's not about rejecting the body or despising it. The body is a gift, a sacred tool that allows us to navigate the world of form. But it's not the final destination. Once we reach the shore of spiritual awakening, we understand that the body has done its job. And like the raft or the fan, it can be left behind. The body is the vehicle that gets us where we need to go. But it's not who we are. The journey continues beyond it, into realms of existence that are untouched by physical form, where the soul soars free, unburdened, and fully realized. This transformation is central to spiritual liberation. As the veil of the physical world lifts, we begin to perceive something extraordinary, a reality beyond form, beyond the need for physical sensation. Enlightenment is not just a peaceful state or the culmination of spiritual effort. It is the ultimate release from the attachments that bind us to the material plane. Think of it like a candle in a lantern. The flame, the soul, illuminates the lantern, making it glow from the inside. But the lantern itself is not the source of light. It is the flame that gives life to the lantern. When we are embodied, we often mistake the lantern for the flame, just as we mistake the body for our true self. Enlightenment is like realizing that the flame exists independently of the lantern, and that when the lantern is no longer needed, the flame will continue to burn brightly, untouched by its departure. This understanding can radically change the way we view death, suffering, and the inevitable decay of the body. In our unenlightened state, we fear these things because they threaten the physical form to which we've grown so attached. We mourn the loss of youth, of vitality, of loved ones. We see illness and death as enemies. But once enlightenment is attained, these fears dissipate like mist under the morning sun. Death is no longer seen as an end, but simply the shedding of the body, much like a snake shedding its skin when it outgrows it. Consider the words of the Taoist sage Laozi, who taught that life and death are but two sides of the same coin, both natural and inevitable parts of the Tao, the universal way of all things. In Taoist philosophy, resisting the natural flow of life is the root cause of suffering. By clinging to the body, we resist the very nature of existence, which is ever-changing and impermanent. Enlightenment comes when we learn to let go, to trust the flow, and to recognize that the true self is not bound by the physical world. When this realization dawns, the body becomes secondary, and the fear of its loss fades away. But what does it mean to truly let go of the body? Its answer lies in the profound shift of consciousness that occurs at the moment of enlightenment. It is not merely a philosophical idea or intellectual understanding. It is an embodied experience, a total shift in perception. The mystics of Sufism, like the great poet Rumi, often spoke of this shift as a kind of death before death. In one of his most famous lines, Rumi writes, "Die before you die." This is not a call to physical death, but to the death of the ego, the false self that clings to the body and the material world. In this context, the body represents more than just the physical form. It represents our attachments, our desires, and our identification with the material plane. To die before you die is to release these attachments and awaken to the truth that the soul is not confined by the body. When this happens, we no longer see the body as essential to our existence. We continue to live within it, but we are no longer bound by it. And when the time comes for the body to die, it is simply a passage, not an end. The Buddha's teachings echo this sentiment in the practice of mindfulness and detachment. In his quest for enlightenment, the Buddha realized that clinging to the body and its cravings was the source of all suffering. The Four Noble Truths explain that suffering arises from attachment and desire, particularly the desire to hold on to the impermanent, whether it's physical pleasures, emotional states, or the body itself. To reach nirvana or enlightenment, one must let go of these attachments. The body becomes merely a vehicle for experiencing life, and once the lesson is learned, the vehicle is no longer required. This brings us to an important point. The body in and of itself is not the problem. It is our identification with the body that creates suffering. The great Advaita teacher Ramana Maharshi often reminded his followers that the body is neither to be rejected nor clung to. It is simply to be observed. The more we identify with the body, the more we are caught in the illusion of separateness. But when we detach from it, when we see the body as a temporary form, like a set of clothes we wear for a time, then we are free. Enlightenment is this freedom. So, if the body is no longer needed after enlightenment, what happens to the soul? Where does it go? Spiritual traditions differ in their descriptions, but they all agree on one thing. The soul is liberated from the cycle of birth and death. In Hinduism and Buddhism, this liberation is known as moksha or nirvana, respectively. It is the end of samsara, the endless cycle of reincarnation. The soul, having transcended the need for physical form, merges with the infinite, becoming one with the source of all existence. Some spiritual traditions describe this merging as a return to God or the divine. In Christianity, the concept of eternal life after enlightenment can be found in the teachings of mystics like Saint John of the Cross, who wrote of the dark night of the soul as the passage through which one comes to experience divine union. In this state, the soul no longer needs the body because it has realized its oneness with God. The body is left behind, but the soul lives on in a state of eternal bliss and unity. In the Eastern Orthodox Christian tradition, this idea is referred to as theosis or divinization, where the enlightened soul becomes fully united with God, transcending the limitations of the body and the material world. The body, once a necessary vehicle for spiritual development, is no longer required when one reaches this state of divine union. Ultimately, the body's role is to serve as a conduit for spiritual awakening. It is through the body that we experience the world, learn our lessons, and undergo the trials that lead to enlightenment. But once those lessons are learned, once the soul awakens to its true nature, the body's purpose is fulfilled. It becomes like the shell of a butterfly, necessary for growth but discarded once the transformation is complete. The soul, now fully realized, takes flight, free from the constraints of the physical world. In this way, we begin to see the body not as a prison but as a stepping stone. It is through the body that we come to know the world, and through the world that we come to know the self. But the body is not the end. It is simply the means to an end, a temporary vessel that carries us toward the ultimate realization of who we truly are, the essence of our existence. It is not merely about transcending physical form or avoiding suffering. It is about the revelation of a higher truth, a truth that surpasses the boundaries of space and time. When we are enlightened, we no longer cling to the illusion that the body defines us or that it is the essence of our existence. Instead, we awaken to an experience of the infinite, a state where the body becomes irrelevant to who we truly are. Throughout this journey, we have touched upon various spiritual traditions and teachings that echo this same core realization. The body is a temporary vehicle, and enlightenment is the liberation from its constraints. Now it is time to delve deeper into what happens after this realization, into the nature of the soul's existence beyond the physical, and how this ultimate release changes everything. Imagine a bird that has been kept in a cage all its life. The bird may come to believe that the cage is its entire world, but one day the door of the cage is opened, and the bird realizes that it can fly. It leaves the cage behind, soaring into the vastness of the sky. The cage served its purpose. It kept the bird safe. It gave the bird a home. But once the bird knows the freedom of the sky, the cage is no longer needed. The bird does not return to it because it has outgrown the need for such confinement. In much the same way, the enlightened soul is like that bird. The body is the cage, a form that holds the soul for a time, allowing it to experience the lessons of the material world. But once enlightenment is achieved, once the soul realizes that it is boundless and free, it no longer needs the limitations of the body. The physical form, like the cave, has served its purpose, but now the soul is ready to soar into the infinite. The enlightened state is often described as one of boundless awareness or oneness with all things. In Hinduism, this is called Satchitananda, existence, consciousness, and bliss. It is the realization that the soul is not separate from the universe but is part of an endless eternal consciousness. Once this realization dawns, the body is seen as a small part of a much larger whole. It is not rejected or despised, but it is no longer clung to because the soul has found its true identity in the infinite. The Buddha's teachings, too, point to this state of liberation. In his final sermon before his death, the Buddha spoke of parinibbana, the complete and final liberation of the soul from the cycle of birth and death. After enlightenment, the soul is no longer bound to the physical world or the laws of karma. It is freed from the need to reincarnate and no longer needs a body to exist. This freedom is the ultimate goal of Buddhist practice, the realization that there is no self in the body and that the true self is beyond all form. As we move beyond the need for the body, we must also consider what it means to experience life after enlightenment. It is tempting to imagine a kind of disembodied existence floating in the void of pure consciousness, but the truth is more profound than that. Enlightenment does not mean the loss of experience. It means the transformation of experience. When the body is no longer needed, we begin to perceive existence in a completely new way. Take the example of Zen Master Dogen, who spoke of the experience of time and space after enlightenment. Dogen taught that enlightenment is not about escaping the world but seeing it for what it truly is: fluid, interconnected, and ever-changing. In his famous Shobogenzo, Dogen described how after enlightenment, we come to see that there is no separation between ourselves and the world. The body, once seen as a boundary between the self and the universe, dissolves into a broader sense of unity. Time is no longer linear. Space is no longer limited, and the soul experiences a kind of timeless presence that transcends all physical constraints. This is where we touch the heart of why the body is not needed after enlightenment. The body is necessary only as long as we are bound by the illusion of separateness, by the belief that we are distinct from the world around us. But once this illusion falls away, the soul enters a state of unity with all that is. In this state, there is no longer a need for a physical form to interact with the world because the soul is now one with the entire cosmos. Every moment, every atom, every breath of wind is part of the soul's experience, and the body becomes redundant in this vast field of awareness. In Christian mysticism, this union with the divine is described as the ultimate goal of the soul. This mystical union is also echoed in Sufi teachings, where the ultimate goal is to experience fana, the annihilation of the ego in the presence of God. In this state, the soul dissolves into the divine, experiencing an ecstasy beyond the physical realm. The body, once necessary for the soul's journey, becomes irrelevant as the soul merges with the infinite presence of God. The Sufi poet Hafiz wrote, "I have learned so much from God that I can no longer call myself anything but love." In this state of pure love and unity, the physical body is left behind, no longer required for the soul's expression. But what about those who continue to live in the body after enlightenment? Many enlightened beings, such as the Buddha, Jesus, or Laozi, continue to live in their physical forms even after reaching spiritual liberation. This is not because they needed the body for themselves, but because they had a mission to fulfill, a teaching to impart. The body, in these cases, becomes a tool for helping others, a way to communicate and guide those who are still bound by the physical world. This is the concept of the Bodhisattva in Mahayana Buddhism, an enlightened being who, out of compassion, chooses to remain in the world to help others achieve liberation. The Bodhisattva does not need the body for their own enlightenment, but they use it as a means to assist others. In this way, the body becomes a vehicle of service, not a limitation. Ultimately, the enlightened soul reaches a point where the body is no longer necessary for its own growth or experience. The physical form, once central to our identity and existence, fades into the background as the soul expands into the infinite. The body, like a tool that has served its purpose, is set aside, and the soul continues its journey beyond the confines of the material world. The body is not something to be feared, rejected, or clung to. It is a sacred vessel, a temporary form that allows us to navigate the world and experience the lessons of life. But when enlightenment is attained, we transcend the need for this form, stepping into a state of boundless freedom, unity, and eternal presence. The body may fall away, but the soul continues forever, part of the infinite dance of existence.